Like if you're always living the fantasy of what it should be, then you can't really deal with what is. And it's not like the more you reject it, it's going to go away. Like it's not like if I don't accept this and the hurricane's going to skip my house. Like the time to think about the meaning of your life is not when you're about to lose your life.
What's the entry point to thinking that?
Yeah, move to Florida.
Kadam Michelle, thanks for dropping in on the podcast today.
Hey, you're welcome. Happy to be here.
Great. So at some point in this journey, you landed in Florida. For some years you were teaching there. What was that like for you?
I taught there for 4 years. So I went during COVID. And I'd never lived in Florida. You know, my grandmother lived there, so I visited a few times. And Florida was always thought to be the place that you go to retire. And beaches, spring break, golf courses, and then alligators. And that's kind of the general image of Florida. One of the biggest things in Florida is the hurricane season, which is half the year. And so that is very much part of your life there.
So could you explain a little bit like that, maybe your experience of being in the middle of that? And obviously at this time too, you're a resident teacher and you're practicing Dharma. I'm guessing that would have kind of informed a lot of what happened for you.
Yeah, the time I was there in the 4 years, we had actually 3 major hurricanes, which is quite a lot in 4 years. And in 1 year, we actually had the 2 back to back. And there's so many spiritual lessons involved in being part of a natural disaster that I had never experienced before. Yeah.
The first hurricane that hits your first hurricane, I'm guessing.
No, that was... sorry, I know, it's hard to keep track. No, the first one that hit was actually Hurricane Ian. And that one ended up hitting more south, Fort Myers, Sanibel Island. And that was, there was a lot of deaths with that one. You know, with the hurricanes in general, when you know one is coming, you have to do a lot of preparation. And so, of course, there can be a lot of stress and anxiety that comes with that because it's such a lesson in uncertainty. It's such a lesson in impermanence. And it really hits home that you have no control. And even in the weather forecasts, when they're helping you to understand like the track of the hurricane, like where it's going to go, it's actually called the cone of uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And one of the main teachings in Buddhism is that our life is pervaded by uncertainty. And so I thought that was so interesting that they call it like the cone of uncertainty. Like, and they'll say, we are now entering the cone of uncertainty, as if it's something different than what you're normally living in, but our whole life is pervaded by uncertainty. And so you have to deal with that. And, we love to be in control. We love to control everything because we want to be happy. We want to be free from suffering. And we think that comes from the externals. And so if you can control the externals and if you can control other people and events and so on and so forth, then you would never invite suffering into your life. And so in a situation like that, you realize like how little control you have really over anything. And so it really hits home that wisdom of uncertainty.
Did you feel like at that time that challenged your understanding of that or challenged your practice of being okay with uncertainty? Because that is one unbelievably unstable situation to be in.
Yeah, because you really don't know. And so in all 3 times we had mandatory evacuations and so you're trying to prepare as much as you can. And you really don't know, like, is a center, is it going to get destroyed? And is it going to get flooded? Or is the roof going to get ripped off? Because you have danger from both wind and water. So you think, well, I'll raise up everything off the ground if there's a flood. But then if the roof gets ripped off, that won't do any good. And then if you leave everything on the floor, well, if we get flooded? And so you go through all these scenarios because your impulse is you want to kind of save everything, and you don't want anything to get destroyed. But the more you go through all the different scenarios, you just start to realize that actually there's not much you can do. And finally, like it's just stuff that can get replaced. And so you do go through this like detachment process where you're peaceful and you're accepting with whatever happens. You know, if we lose the center, I know we just replaced the carpet and the sound system and we just repainted, but you know, and you have to be at peace with that because that's the reality. Because getting upset or getting stressed or worried, it's not going to make the hurricane skip your home or your business. It doesn't work that way. And so there is a big process of letting go, I would say, and just complete acceptance, which is one of my favorite definitions and favorite practices, because patient acceptance, it's where you happily accept or peacefully accept whatever arises, giving up the idea that it should be other than what it is. And I think, especially in these times, it's such an important practice because we're always wanting things to be other than what they are, you know? And so to get into that space where you completely accept, you know, if we lose the center, if I lose my home, if I lose my car, you know, to keep a peaceful mind in acceptance with that knowledge. And it does take a while to get there. Yeah, it takes a while to get there.
And for you, was it like, well, I can only guess, like that must have been incredibly challenging. Like, so we can say, accept it, be at peace with it and so forth.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing for you at that time, you know, and for everyone else involved in that, it's like such a challenging situation to be able to accept and be at peace because that fear seems very rational. It's like, well, we may lose the center, I may lose my home,
Yeah.
I may lose my car, I may even lose my life.
Yeah.
Is it possible to be accept and be at peace with that? Was that your experience or did you?
Yeah, because you don't really have any other alternative. Like, it's not like if I don't accept this, then the hurricane's going to skip my house or skip the center. So that's just not an option. And then it's like you're training with respect to what's happening in real time. And it was so interesting because both times, you know, because again, you're in the cone of uncertainty, the hurricane bumped and it didn't actually ever hit us directly. And so it ended up hitting other cities directly. And it was so interesting because then later when I moved to Washington, D.C., you know, I'd put a lot of thought in like where I was going to park my car and where I was going to park the center car. And, you know, you don't want to park it near a tree because then if the tree falls and then you have like the wind and if it floods and if salt water gets into the engine, your car is done. And so you're thinking like, what's the safest place? And so my car, like, you know, lived through all three hurricanes. But then I go to Washington, D.C., and a truck hits my car and completely totals it. So, but it was interesting because I really watched my mind when I got the news. I had lent my car out and they said, I'm really sorry, but, you know, a truck, they were okay. The drivers were okay. They said, but your car is completely totaled. And because I had done so much practice with letting go with respect to the hurricanes, my mind, I have to say, like, it was very, very peaceful. And I said, well, I'm like, the most important thing is that you guys are okay. Like, that's totally fine. Like, don't worry about the car. And then I had to check in every day, like, is my mind okay about this? And I was like, no, I peacefully accept. I give up the idea that I should have a car that's not all crumpled, but that's just what it is. So keep a peaceful mind, keep a peaceful mind. But it was because of all that previous preparation.
It's like these tragedies, in a sense, and the challenges you face there prepare you really for something, you know, something that's still difficult to deal with, but you're able to,
Yeah, because we tend to think of everything as like ours. And so you start to transition. And one of my favorite practices is you start to think, well, everything's borrowed. Like everything in this life is borrowed. It's not like on paper it might be mine or conventionally it might be mine, but in reality, everything is borrowed. You know, we bring nothing with us. We take nothing with us. You know, when I came out of my mom's womb, I didn't have like a suitcase with a onesie and like a diaper starter kit. You literally bring nothing with you. When you leave, you cannot take anything, you know, even the body. And so you start to relate to everything as being borrowed. And that really helps to lessen the attachment, because with attachment, we want to keep it forever. And we feel like we need it. And it's, you know, a true source of happiness. And so the mind becomes much lighter when we think of everything as being borrowed for this life. And you might use it your whole life. Like we'll use our body our whole life, but it's still just borrowed from our parents. And it's like that shift in perspective that helps so much with the attachment, you know, lessening that attachment. And so if you know you could lose absolutely everything, it's so painful to still try to hold on. Whereas if you can just let go, and you don't know whether you're going to lose it or not. Like I remember leaving the center and just looking around thinking like, I have no idea what I'm going to come back to. but whatever I come back to, like, it's okay. Like, it's okay. Like, it's okay. And so you have those practices and those insights that you're focusing on.
Yeah, it's such a powerful way to see it like that. And I can imagine, like in your experience, trying to work with it in that way. But so many people, they feel like so much of their life is invested in all of these external possessions, their home. Not just that, but just also they don't have the money to replace it.
Yeah.
And I can just imagine as a hurricane's about to hit, the level of anxiety and fear and stress anyone would feel in that situation must be overwhelming. Did you see much of that happening? Were you able to help people with that when you were in that situation?
Yeah, I think it depends. Like, people who had lived a long time in Florida, they're mainly concerned about what hurricane snacks you should have. And it's more like, I was very new, so of course, you're dealing with this all for the first time. But when you're directly going to be hit, then obviously that's very different. But I would say, like, the practice that everybody would go back to, whether they're Buddhist or not, is that acceptance. Like, well, whatever happens, like, we'll just deal with it. And then I think it also makes a difference when you're part of that community, because what happens, and one of the most heartwarming things, is after the hurricane, and everyone chips in to help everyone who's affected. So if you weren't directly affected, or if your property didn't get destroyed, then your job is really to then help others who were affected. And so you had people opening up their homes, and you had people, making food and delivering the food, and, people lending their car. And so you see this huge generosity, this like outpouring of giving and compassion, and, at a level that you just don't normally see, like, collectively like that. And I think that's very common after any kind of tragedy. You see that outpouring of help and assistance. And so when you live in a community like that, like, because you also have that makes a big difference, like, if something happens.
And what did that teach you at that time? So you're in the middle of all of this, and people losing their homes and so forth, and that kind of togetherness. What did it teach you at that time? Did it give you some insight into humanity and their potential?
Yeah, I mean, it's very heartwarming. So we, there was a group of us. We had a lot of debris and, like, tree limbs on the center roof and things like that. But once we got cleaned up, then we started to help. I did some park cleanups and some beach cleanups. And those are very interesting because, especially the beach houses, are typically very wealthy. And, the water just, like, went in and just destroyed, the bottom level of those houses. And so you're on this, like, big, beautiful beach. And then there's like a Peloton right in the middle of the sand, or like somebody's photo album, and just people's personal effects, like, in the sand, in the water. And so you just realize like how fragile, the situation is, because it just takes one storm, and then, like, your house is destroyed, your possessions are destroyed. But you have this, collective energy of people then, cleaning up. So I did some beach cleanups, some park cleanups. We did cooking, and we would deliver the food to places that still didn't have power, so they couldn't cook. And so you end up meeting a lot of people. So people from all walks of life, are getting together to collectively help. And, you're delivering meals to people who have been living outside, like, with their kids, so they have, like, no clothes, no food. And so there's this helping and being helped atmosphere, which, all coming from compassion. And so it is very, very powerful, because people tend to, just stay in their kind of circle of either family or friends, or people feel, like, isolated, but it's just everyone comes together. And that really creates, I think, a nice society. And we need to keep doing that, and to do that more, and to get out of the self, and to genuinely, like, be of assistance to others and to help others. Because I think it's like a privilege to be able to help someone.
It's interesting, because in this day and age, like, life is so hectic. There's so many demands on your time and energy. It feels like, to most people, for most of us, it feels like just dealing with that is enough. So kind of getting a little bit lost in myself is kind of the price I pay for living in this modern life.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is actually it's the opposite.
It's actually the opposite. Yeah.
But how does a person who's under that kind of pressure and stuff begin to think in that way? Like, what's the entry point to thinking that?
Yeah, move to Florida. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think we have a lot more in common with other people than we might think. And like the base commonality is that we all have a wish to be happy and to be free from suffering. So it doesn't matter what your gender is, what your nationality is, what your religion is. Like across the board, from the point of view of what's inside of our heart, we're all the same. And so especially when something like that happens, you're not so much paying attention to like what religion the person is. It's just this person needs food and I'm going to deliver them food. Like you're not thinking about all those other divisions we tend to make in society, you know, like position and power and, you know, all those things that change anyway. You just relating to people as people and they don't want to experience suffering and they just want to be happy. And right now they need to be helped. And I'm in a position to be able to help others. And so, you know, going with that.
Yeah, it's interesting because the way you juxtapose the situation, the people on the beach who are normally wealthy are just as vulnerable as the people further inland at that time. And it's kind of like levels things a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. So what is the quote? Like at the time of death, the king and the beggar are the same.
Right.
You know? And yeah, so there's a lot of lessons in that kind of event. And then now, like when natural disasters happen, you know, we just had the earthquakes in Venezuela. And so, you know, of course, then a lot of compassion comes up because you know what it's like from one point of view to live like without those resources or that destruction, you know, or like the loss. And so you can sympathize more than maybe you could have before that experience. Like somebody who's had cancer, as soon as somebody else says, oh, I have cancer, like immediately, like there's a bond. Like I know what you're going through. And there's just like this heart-to-heart bond because you've been through something either similar or the same.
Yeah, I think that's really like, to me, when I'm listening to you, like a key aspect of this, what I'm hearing from your experience since, is it's really informed a lot of the way you think about things. And I actually, it's a curious point to me is how have you applied what you learned during that period to how you see life in general? So we all go through storms in life, whether it's an actual physical hurricane or just a breakup of a relationship and so forth.
Yeah.
How has it changed how you approach that and experience that now?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think you don't ever really leave the cone of uncertainty. And so it's not like just when there's a hurricane, you're in the cone of uncertainty, but your life is pervaded by uncertainty. And so that really brings that lesson to the forefront and that wisdom to the forefront, how everything is impermanent, you know, can just take, like the earthquake was 90 seconds, 120 seconds. And in such a short period of time, you can lose like your family, you can lose your home, your business, your whole town. And so like the fragility and the impermanence of things, that's another huge lesson that comes up. And so, you know, in the story I told about the car, you know, so it survived the hurricanes, but then ends up getting hit by a truck. And actually the driver was from Florida, which I thought was very funny. Because when I saw the report, I was like, he's from Florida.
I probably helped him. No, he's cool.
I know. And so those lessons stay with you, but also because I have a regular meditation practice. And so these are all regular meditations that come up in the new meditation handbook. So meditation number 2, you know, death and impermanence. Meditation number 1, precious human life. And then when you meditate on renunciation, and one of the aspects of renunciation is realizing that you're living in uncertainty. And so the meditations and then the meditations on love and compassion, so all that's being reinforced by what you experienced. And so for me personally, it's just strengthened all those meditations. So it's like they inform each other, you know, your daily meditation practice and your daily life, and they feed into each other, you know, and it just goes back and forth, back and forth.
And do you feel like maybe say like something's happening now? You obviously talked about the car being crushed and so forth, but like, do you feel like sometimes still like the memories of that period, things are happening in your life now, and it's kind of kind of pacified the way you may see? Like, or have you got stories of you like, oh, well, that link between these two makes me able to work with this better? Because often I think tragedy, we often feel there's nothing you can use from that. There's nothing good to come out of that.
Yeah.
I just have to live with the pain of that. But actually, it seems the way you're talking, there's a different way.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of our main practices is it's to transform all daily appearances into the spiritual path. And so whatever arises, and, it's interesting because I've moved around so much, like there's always something, like Arizona, it's like fire. And then, California, it's fire. And then there it's, hurricanes. And now I'm in DC and it's politicians. And you might have to edit that out. But it's like there's no place where you can go. And so like it's all impermanence or it's all uncertainty, but it just looks different. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
like
totally.
It just, yeah, it just looks different. And so especially moving around, I feel like it also gives a lot of flexibility because you're in so many different situations and environments and different cultures, and to be able to adapt and kind of go with the flow and be able to apply the Dharma. Yeah, it's been very, very interesting.
And I'm just interested. We have so much going on in our world at the moment. So you've gone through this period and periods, as you say, where there's those kind of things happening. But what is it that you've learned from that period that can help us deal with this quite uncertain and unstable time we're in?
Yeah, I think it's being at peace with the uncertainty. And it's that mind of patient acceptance. I peacefully accept whatever arises, giving up the idea that it should be other than what it is. And for me, that's such a main practice because, like, we're always rejecting. And, watch, starting tomorrow, watch how many times you reject something. And it could, like, as soon as we wake up, we're like, I don't want to get up. And then I don't want to go to work. And then you see someone you don't like and like, I don't want to talk to that person. And there's just constant rejection, or I don't like AI, or I don't like what's going on public. Like there's this constant rejection of things. And in Buddhism, that mind of patient accepting is you're accepting, which doesn't mean agreeing or being passive. And I think that's where people get tripped up maybe with the language. You're peacefully accepting what has come into existence, whereas like anger rejects what has come into existence, which doesn't make sense because it's happened or it's happening. And so the first step, it has to be acceptance, or like an acknowledgement of what's come into existence. And then the next question is, okay, now what do I do about it? So it's like two parts, because you can't really deal with something unless you've accepted it first. Like if you're always living the fantasy of what it should be, then you can't really deal with what is. Like if you're always singing, they shouldn't be doing that, they shouldn't be doing that. Well, the fact is that they are. So now what are we going to do about it? Is there something I can do? Is there something or is there nothing I can do? And so you start thinking with more wisdom instead of just like emotional reaction that's not really helping or solving the problem anyway. And so I think that can be applied to any situation. I think that really has to be one of our main practices, is patient acceptance.
Yeah, I mean, do you know what's interesting about that is, especially with what we're talking about today, is it seems to me in the way you're saying that rejection or non-acceptance is like the kind of trigger point for an awful lot of overthinking, catastrophizing, anxiety. Yeah. So I'm guessing, say, for example, if in the situation in the hurricane that we're talking about, that could be such a destabilizing experience, the non-acceptance or the outright rejection.
Yeah, because it can just be painful. It's like you're watching it and it's like, no. And we do that a lot with life. Like, no, this shouldn't be happening. No, this shouldn't be happening. They shouldn't be saying this. And it's not like the more you reject it, it's going to go away. Mm-hmm. And so it's like all these things are coming. And for example, like old age is coming, so.
But isn't it also the more you accept it, it's not going to go away either?
Yeah, it's not going to go away either. But you're not going to have that mental pain. And so most of our emotional problems is because we don't accept things. And so it creates that stress and that tension. And that's why there's so much tension and stress in people's minds, because they're always in opposition. Like we're always in opposition to what's actually arising in our life, rather than, okay, I peacefully accept, is there anything I can do, or is there nothing I can do? And I know, all of this is very easy to say, and I do, so I'm not saying it lightly, like, oh, you just, and then in 5 seconds, you're fine. Like, that's why it's regarded as a practice. We have to keep coming back to that. Instead of blindly reacting with unhappiness and anger, like, is that actually helping? And in fact, it helps even less because now your mind is clouded with anger, stress, anxiety. And so to even think of a solution, like, there's no space in the mind. And so really taking that step back and thinking, okay, is this going to help? Like, is it helpful to think like this? And taking more time to respond as opposed to blindly, like, emotionally reacting. And I think those two are very, very different. And meditation practice, what it does is it gives you that space in the mind where you can choose a beneficial response. And so the externals may not change, but our experience will. And if you check, that is what people really want, to be happy and free from suffering. That is what they want. So it'll help to solve that inner problem. The outer problem, maybe we can solve it, maybe we can't. But again, we don't like that. Like, we want to be able to solve every outer problem, which is why people will say, like, if I was in charge, I'd fix everything in the world, because we like to have that control. Yeah.
And for the person who would push back on that and say, actually, it's only when I get angry that I actually do something about things. And I'm getting angry at all the injustice in the world. And that's actually energizing me to do something about it.
Yeah.
This acceptance sounds nice, but isn't there a place for anger too?
Yeah, that's a very common question. Because again, I live in DC, so you have a lot of protests and a lot of, it's enmeshed in the politics. And again, like, of course, anger does have energy that goes with it. But equally, compassion has energy that goes with it. And if you check, it's interesting because anger and compassion, they actually do have something in common. Like, with anger, you want the person to stop. And with compassion, you also want the person to stop, but it's coming from very different viewpoints. And out of compassion, you want the suffering to stop because you want suffering to come to an end, and you want that negative behavior to stop because it's creating that suffering. And so the way that you would go about it would be, it would be coming from that motivation of compassion. And if you check, like, with anger, there's always this intention to harm more. So oftentimes, trying to justify something or trying to fight something out of anger often creates more problems, or maybe more of a short-term solution, where something that's arising out of peace and compassion, because you're thinking about everybody involved and the way you would go about it would be much different, if that makes sense. But I think there's
Totally.
equally an energy to compassion, and it's actually a more stable energy, and it's a more wise energy. Yeah.
And how would that help the problems we see in the world at the moment, in your view? Because there are so many.
Yeah, I mean, you see so many organizations born from compassion, like they want to relieve the suffering of others, or child abuse, or, substance abuse. And so we have a lot of organizations that are founded out of compassion that are addressing the problem. And, hatred always just wants to bring, like, quick destruction, and it often lays the foundation for future conflict, as we've seen. We don't want to think that there's no energy with compassion. There's actually a huge amount of energy that comes with compassion, and it's way more stable. Like, love and compassion is way more stable. Like, if you're getting angry with your kid all the time about their behavior, they're actually just going to get worse. Like, we think the more I reject someone, the more they'll be like, oh, I'm a terrible person, I must change. But that's not how it works. Like, if you think, the people you feel the most comfortable with and have helped you the most are the people who have unconditionally loved you and accepted you, and then you have space to grow and to learn. And it's almost like you want to be better for them because they love you. Whereas, like, when somebody is, like, down on you and they're criticizing and yelling at you and punishing, you actually act worse. And so I think parents know that and teachers know that, that there has to be that acceptance of the child. So I always go back to that analogy of, like, a parent and a child to help me to understand, like, bigger context. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that, because I think at some level what I'm hearing you say is it keeps coming back to if we choose our response. But I think, as you're saying, that requires maybe somebody to have some space in their mind to choose that, to meditate. I just wonder, is there some advice we can all take on board, even if you don't meditate, that you can actually practically do when these kind of challenges hit you, the storms of life hit you, or a hurricane hits you? Is there something we can practically do there?
Yeah, I think, again, I would encourage a daily meditation practice.
Sure.
If we're able to, just because, meditation is that tool that changes the mind at a deep level, because we do need that time to contemplate and to plan our response. And so if we're never practicing a different kind of response, in the moment, and so, you can be inspired by something, which is great, and you can have great advice. But the whole reason why we meditate is to then take that practice of patient acceptance, develop that mind, hold it, become familiar with it. And we do that again and again. So when push comes to shove, that's what you rely upon because you've been training your mind. And the time to do it is really not when the event is happening. So it's actually when you have calmer conditions. So for example, like the time to prepare for death is not like when you're dying.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like you want to, like, it's coming. So in that sense, like if we go back to the hurricanes, like, it's coming. And so it gives you that time to prepare. So we know like aging is coming, death is coming, of us and our loved ones. So actually like now is the time to prepare. And how am I going to respond when this happens? Like when I get sick, like I'm not sick now, but sickness is inevitable. So what are the practices I'm going to do to keep a happy mind or to keep a peaceful mind? And I think that aspect is so important because it's very preventative. It's like preventative medicine for mental suffering. And then when you're used to developing compassion and you're used to, meditating and gaining that peace of mind, then when those events happen, you've built like an inner refuge that you can rely upon. So it's like going to the shelter in a hurricane, like you're going to an external refuge, but you have to go to an internal refuge as well, whether it's a hurricane or any of other life's, challenges. And so I would just strongly recommend, like the starting point is reading those practices and having some kind of meditation practices. So when those things do happen, you have some preparation in the mind.
It's an interesting one that you bring up that, and I really love that because I think so many of us don't actually think I can train my mind to prepare for tragedy or adversity or even, as you say, death.
Yeah, because we don't know the outcome of many, many things. And so a lot of our meditation objects are getting in accordance with reality. Like we're not more important than anybody else. Things are impermanent, like death is definite. So it's not like the less I think about death, like the more it's not going to happen. And rather than deny these truths, we actually meditate on them. And it can be uncomfortable at first. Like when I first meditate on death and impermanence, I'm like, why am I meditating on death and I'm 20 years old and I should be at a bar? Like, what am I doing? And, but it's like, you meditate on it now. And in that context, when you meditate on death and impermanence, it helps so much with stress and anxiety. It seems like it would be the opposite, but you realize like what's important in the light of death. Like in the light of impermanence, you realize what's important. And many people will say that at the near-death experience. Like nobody says like, I almost died. I need to work in the office more. Or, they realize like what's most important. And it's always something spiritual, like loving others and not arguing and overcoming my anger. And it's usually like a spiritual insight, which is precisely why we meditate on death. So we can take advantage of our precious human life now while we have it. Like the time to think about the meaning of your life is not when you're about to lose your life. And so we tend to like wait to the end to deal with these things. So I think, like what you're saying, like, I don't want to die, but I think we have to get to that place, like, okay, I don't want to die, but death is definite. The time of death is uncertain. So how can I prepare for what's going to inevitably happen? And how can I be at peace with that as opposed to rejecting it or not liking it or not wanting it?
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were saying that you were 20 years of age and that was your first meditation on death. I do think, like, I hear that sometimes I'm speaking to family and friends around that age, and they do say, like, it's the last thing I want to think
Yeah.
about is whether I'm going to die today. I want to think about how I'm going to live today because I'm
Yeah.
young and I've got everything ahead of me.
Yeah.
I mean, is there value in that from your own experience? Obviously, you started quite young yourself, for
Yeah.
somebody of that age to really think in that way.
Yeah, because I mean, it's not just people who are old and sick that die. So many 20-year-olds die, babies die. And so death doesn't have an age. And I remember I did hospice and I went on an interview, and the interview was to help take care of the man's 95-year-old father. And so in the whole interview, it was so interesting because they kept talking, because he's going to die soon. He's going to die soon. He's going to die soon. And after the interview, it was like I lived here, the interview was here, and then the Buddhist center was here. And so I went to the interview, and then I went to the meditation center. And then I didn't get a call back. So I thought, oh, I wonder what happened. Like, I thought the interview went really well, and I live so close, and it would work out for everyone. And so I called my boss, and I said, is there any update on this family? And he said, I'm really sorry, but right after you had your interview, he said the son who I had the interview with, he went for a run, and during the run he had a massive heart attack and died. And I thought it was so interesting because our whole conversation was about the dad dying. And then literally after my interview, he goes for a run and then he drops dead. And, he's 30 years younger than his dad. So now his wife, with the father. And so that was a very sobering, because we have this perception that death just happens to like the old and the sick. And so I think actually you need to meditate on death as young as possible because it will frame the rest of your life. And you won't get caught up in like what people are thinking about me and, meaningless things. It gives so much meaning to your life, which is the benefit.
Why
Yeah.
wouldn't you get caught up in worrying about what people think about you if you knew you might?
I mean, I think for me, if today was my last day, would I really care if this person doesn't like me? And the answer is no. And if you go through everything, like the answer is no, I wouldn't be worrying about this. You don't want to go to the extreme, like I'm going to die, you're going to die, so let's not even learn each other's names. That would be an extreme. Or I'm not going to pay my bills because I might die. So that would be an extreme of that meditation. But if you think like I only have so much time left, what do I want to do with that time that I have? And so another one of my favorite practices is whenever I meet anyone, I think, okay, I only have so much time with this person. And that could be just like a 5-minute interaction. It could be a 2-year friendship. It could be, a lifetime. But it's still a short amount of time, 10, 20, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. It's still a relatively short amount of time. And so I think, I'm impermanent, they're impermanent. We're only meeting for a short time. So how can I make this interaction meaningful consistently? And it's to cherish them and to consider their happiness to be important and to have compassion for them because they experience suffering just like everybody else. And then that will create like a harmonious relationship day to day. I think it's when we forget about death, we can get caught up in negativity and stress and anxiety and, exaggerating the importance of things. So it's a little bit counterintuitive because it sounds like it would be depressing to meditate on death. But I think part of that understanding is you understand the value, and you don't meditate on death to then develop fear. You meditate on death to then, therefore, I'm going to use my life in a meaningful way. And that's the conclusion. So you're not meditating on fear. And I think that's the...
It's powerful, isn't it, that? Because you think about, all we want to do is have a good day today. And when you realize you might only have today, then actually it improves the quality of all of your interactions. I love that bit that you say, like, I might only see them again, this time. And it's very powerful. Yeah.
And so you can just do something like, you go to the store, you buy something from someone, and you probably never see them again. And then you just develop this wish, like, maybe be happy.
Yeah.
And then you've developed, like from a mind point of view, this really nice connection with them, and you've had a nice interaction. You've had a good thought about them. And then if you're doing that repeatedly, then every interaction starts to become meaningful. So, whether something is meaningful or not, it depends upon the mind. And so if we're using, for example, like our relationships to, to fight or to get angry or to get jealous, there's not much meaning because it's causing suffering. But if we're interacting in such a way that, it's leading to peace and to happiness, because like that is our main wish, is finally we just want to be happy and free from suffering. So if we're living a meaningful life, we have to be moving in that direction. And you can take everything and you can transform into the spiritual path. So everything can give rise to a mind that is peaceful. Some things are easier than others to do. And so if that's like the whole context of your life, then when you die, you feel like you've lived such a meaningful life. And that's the benefit of starting, instead of like waiting until you're on your deathbed.
Can you explain to me exactly what you mean by, because you've brought it up a few times, I know you're alluding to it there, just what you feel for you as a meaningful life then?
Yeah, for me, a meaningful life is finding that peace of mind, and overcoming, the inner problems. So like anger, attachment, but also, even as a kid, I always wanted a life where I was helping others. And so you're part of the solution where you're working to bring happiness into the world or more peace into the world, and you're working to lessen the suffering in the world. So another thing I like to think is like people are suffering so much, like why would I want to add to that through like criticism, or harsh speech or angry speech? Why would I want to add to this person's suffering? And so for me, a meaningful life is, just that, like improving the mind, moving towards that happiness and freedom for oneself personally, but then also helping others in the same way as best you can, or at whatever capacity.
And do you feel that is your life these days?
I feel like, I feel like most of it is. I don't know, my family might have a different opinion. Because we do, there is a lot of like complaining about how the world is. And so I think, again, like it's very easy to react to everything that we see on the television. But I think if we think like, okay, how can I bring more peace and less suffering into this world? And again, like I think we tend to think like all or nothing. Whereas like just start with like your family, start with your workplace. Like how can I make my workplace more peaceful, more meaningful? How can I help like my coworkers get along? Or how can I, and being part of the solution as opposed to part of the chaos, So I feel, I try to do that to the best of my ability. Sometimes I'm better at it than others. Sorry, my sister's in the room.
I think that's a really lovely place to kind of wrap up today's conversation. I'd look forward to continue to have conversations with you on this in the future. Thank you so much, Michelle, for dropping in today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.